May 21st, 1940. 7:30 a.m. Outside the French village of Arras, Hauptmann Wilhelm Rothenburg stood in the cupola of his Panzer III, scanning the misty fields through Zeiss binoculars, watching his regiment's tanks roll forward in perfect formation. The 25th Panzer Regiment had been unstoppable for 11 days, slicing through Belgium and France with such ease that Rothenburg's biggest concern was keeping his supply trucks close enough to feed his advance. The French were broken, the British were retreating, and victory seemed inevitable. Then his radio crackled with a report that made no sense. Contact, British tanks, heavy armour, shells bouncing off. Rothenburg assumed panic or exaggeration. The British had been running for days. Their tanks were obsolete relics, lightly armoured and poorly armed. Every intelligence brief confirmed it, but over the next hour, as more reports flooded in, each more desperate than the last, Rothenburg realised something was terribly wrong. The Wehrmacht was about to learn a brutal lesson about underestimating British engineering. The tank that would teach them this lesson was already rolling toward his position, a squat, angular machine that German intelligence had dismissed as slow, outdated, and tactically irrelevant. They called it the Infantry Tank Mark II, though the British crews knew it by another name, Matilda. Within hours, that name would be spoken in German command posts with a mixture of confusion, frustration, and genuine fear. This is the story of how a tank the Germans mocked became the machine that shattered the myth of Panzer invincibility, how 80mm of British steel stopped the Wehrmacht in its tracks, and how German tank commanders discovered that all their speed and tactical brilliance meant nothing when their shells simply bounced off. The Matilda II had emerged from a uniquely British approach to armoured warfare, one that prioritised infantry support over the glamorous tank versus tank duels that captured imaginations. While other nations designed tanks for breakthrough and exploitation, Britain created two distinct types: cruiser tanks for mobile warfare and infantry tanks for supporting foot soldiers in assault. The Matilda II embodied the infantry tank philosophy, taken to its logical extreme. When Major General Hugh Elles submitted the initial requirements in 1936, he specified armour thick enough to defeat all known anti-tank weapons, even at close range. Speed was secondary, range was negotiable, but protection was absolute. The design team at Vulcan Foundry in Warrington faced an enormous challenge. Creating armour thick enough to meet Elles' requirements meant a vehicle so heavy that existing tank engines couldn't move it at acceptable speeds. The solution was elegant but unconventional. Twin AEC diesel engines, each producing 87 horsepower, mounted side by side and linked through a complicated transmission system. The result was a tank weighing 27 tons, protected by armour ranging from 65 to 78mm on the hull front and turret, with some sections reaching 80mm. To put this in perspective, German Panzer IIIs in 1940 carried 30mm of frontal armour. Panzer IVs had 50mm. The Matilda's protection was nearly double the best German tank of the period. The trade-off was speed, maximum velocity of 15 miles per hour on roads, barely 8 miles per hour cross-country. But British doctrine didn't require speed from infantry tanks. They were meant to advance at walking pace, keeping formation with attacking infantry, using their armour to survive the defensive fire that would tear apart unprotected soldiers. The armament was deliberately modest, a 2-pounder gun firing 40mm armour-piercing rounds at high velocity. Against the thin-skinned panzers of 1940, it was perfectly adequate. The gun could penetrate 50mm of armour at 500 yards, enough to defeat any German tank from the front. A coaxial Besser machine gun provided anti-personnel fire. German intelligence had assessed the Matilda before the war and concluded it was a defensive weapon, suitable for supporting static infantry, but too slow for modern mobile warfare. This assessment was filed away and largely forgotten as panzer divisions practiced Blitzkrieg tactics in Poland. The assumption was that speed and manoeuvre would always defeat static defence. Encounter a slow British tank and simply go around it. The Germans were about to discover that you can't go around a tank when it's blocking the only road through your attack corridor, and you can't destroy what your guns can't penetrate. By May 1940, the British Expeditionary Force in France included 2 tank battalions equipped with Matildas, the 4th Royal Tank Regiment and 7th Royal Tank Regiment, containing about 80 Matilda IIs between them, along with some older Matilda war tanks armed only with machine guns. These were the only heavily armoured tanks available to British forces in France. Everything else, the cruiser tanks, the light tanks, were protected by armour, thin enough that German 37mm anti-tank guns could defeat them routinely. The German advance through the Low Countries and France had been devastating. Belgium fell in 18 days. French armies were shattered or retreating. The British Expeditionary Force was withdrawing toward the Channel ports, hoping to evacuate before being cut off. German confidence was absolute. The Wehrmacht had just demonstrated that its tactical doctrine, combining armour, air power and mobile infantry, could defeat any opponent. On May 20th, German armoured spearheads reached the Channel coast near Abbeville, cutting off Allied forces in Belgium and northern France from the bulk of French armies to the south. The pocket was forming. The British and French were trapped. General Erwin Rommel's 7th Panzer Division was racing north along the Channel coast. General Ferdinand Schall's 10th Panzer Division was pushing toward Arras from the south. Between them, they would close the pocket and ensure Allied destruction. The plan was working perfectly. Then the British did something unexpected. Instead of continuing their retreat, they counterattacked. The Arras counterattack, launched on May 21st, wasn't intended as a major offensive. British and French commanders knew their forces were too weak for that. The goal was limited: disrupt German communications, buy time for forces farther north to establish defensive positions, and generally cause enough confusion to slow the German advance. Major General Harold Franklin commanded the operation with 2 columns. The western column consisted of the 4th and 7th Royal Tank Regiments, Matildas and some Matilda Is, supported by the 6th and 8th Durham Light Infantry Battalions, about 80 tanks and 2,000 infantry. The eastern column had French tanks and infantry. Facing them were elements of Rommel's 7th Panzer Division and Schall's 10th Panzer Division, along with the SS Totenkopf Division, thousands of experienced German soldiers with hundreds of vehicles, extensive air support, and the confidence of an army that had just conquered half of Europe. At 2:30 p.m. on May 21st, British tanks rolled forward through the villages west of Arras. The 4th RTR on the left, 7th RTR on the right, infantry following in trucks and on foot. German forward positions reported enemy tanks approaching but didn't sound particularly alarmed. British tanks had been encountered before and dealt with easily. Then the shooting started and nothing made sense. Lieutenant Hans Bülter, commanding a platoon of Panzer 30 Itis from the 25th Panzer Regiment, spotted British tanks at 800 metres and ordered his gunner to fire. The 37mm K-Bouquet 38 gun, standard armament for the Panzer 38T, cracked repeatedly. Bülter watched through his optics as armour-piercing rounds struck the lead British tank squarely on the frontal armour. Sparks flew. The tank kept coming. 5 rounds, 6 rounds, 7 rounds, all hits, no effect. The British tank's turret traversed slowly, its 2-pounder gun searching for targets. When it fired, Bülter's tank shuddered as a round punched through the 25mm frontal armour, tore through the fighting compartment, and killed his gunner instantly. Bülter bailed out as his tank began to burn. The Matilda rolled past, turret rotating to engage the next target. This scene repeated itself across a front several kilometres wide. German tank commanders, confident in their superiority, engaged British tanks at ranges where their guns should have been lethal. Panzer III crews firing 37mm rounds watched in disbelief as shells bounced off angular British armour, leaving nothing but bright scars on the cast steel. Panzer IV crews, whose 75mm guns were designed for infantry support rather than tank combat, loaded high-explosive shells and scored direct hits that barely scratched the Matilda's paint. Hauptmann Rothenburg, coordinating his regiment's response, couldn't understand what was happening. His tanks had the tactical advantage, good positions, supporting infantry, artillery on call. They were shooting accurately, scoring repeated hits. But British tanks kept advancing, absorbing punishment that should have destroyed them, and returning fire that penetrated German armour with devastating efficiency. The problem was simple mathematics. The Panzer III's 37mm gun could penetrate about 40mm of armour at combat ranges. The Matilda had 78mm on the turret front. The Panzer 38T's gun was even weaker, and while the Panzer IV's 75mm gun was a larger calibre, it fired a low-velocity shell designed for bunker busting, not armour penetration. Against 80mm of British steel, it was nearly useless. The Matilda's 2-pounder, meanwhile, could punch through 50mm at 500 yards. Every German tank on the battlefield was vulnerable. Worse, from the German perspective, the Matildas were nearly invisible. Their low profile and the smoke and dust of battle made them difficult to spot until they were dangerously close. By the time German crews identified a target and fired, the British tank was often within lethal range and already aiming. Oberleutnant Karl Rothenburg, Wilhelm's cousin, commanding another company of Panzer IIIs, radioed in a report that would be repeated in various forms throughout the afternoon. Armour-piercing ammunition ineffective against British heavy tanks. Request anti-tank gun support immediately. The anti-tank guns he was requesting, the standard 37mm Pak-36s, were in position along the German line. They opened fire as Matildas approached and discovered they were equally useless. The 37mm Pak-36 had been Germany's standard anti-tank weapon since the mid-1930s. Against the lightly armoured tanks of Poland and France, it was perfectly adequate. Crews called it the door knocker, not because it was weak, but because it reliably punched through enemy armour. Against the Matilda, it became the door knocker for a different reason. It knocked on the door but couldn't get in. Gun crews fired repeatedly at approaching British tanks, watching shells ricochet into the air or shatter against armour plate. The Matildas advanced through the fire, machine guns chattering, occasionally pausing to fire their 2-pounders at visible targets, then continuing their slow, inexorable advance. Panic began spreading through German infantry positions. Soldiers armed with rifles and machine guns watched their anti-tank guns fail, watched their tanks burn, and realised they had no weapon capable of stopping the approaching monsters. Some units broke and ran. Others held position and died as Matildas rolled through their trenches, machine guns sweeping the ground. The scene was chaotic. British infantry, emboldened by their tanks' invulnerability, pressed forward more aggressively than they had in days. German infantry, accustomed to owning the battlefield, found themselves overrun. Supply columns, command posts, and artillery positions suddenly came under direct fire from British tanks that had punched through the forward defensive line. Rommel, commanding the 7th Panzer Division, received reports of the attack while coordinating operations several kilometres away. His initial response was calm. A local counterattack, nothing the division couldn't handle. Commit reserves, bring up artillery, call in air support, standard procedure. Then he received more detailed reports. British heavy tanks, all anti-tank guns ineffective, multiple panzers destroyed, friendly infantry retreating. Rommel immediately rushed toward the sound of gunfire, a habit that would characterize his entire career. What he found was unlike anything he'd experienced. German units in full retreat, tanks burning, anti-tank guns abandoned, infantry scattered. And advancing through the chaos, British tanks that seemed immune to everything thrown at them. Rommel personally took command of an anti-tank gun battery and discovered what his crews had already learned. The 37mm guns were useless. He ordered every available artillery piece, including 88mm anti-aircraft guns, brought forward and deployed in direct fire roles. The 88mm flak gun would become legendary as a tank killer, but at Arras it was an improvisation born of desperation. The Flak 36 and Flak 37 guns, designed to shoot down bombers at high altitude, fired a shell large enough and fast enough to penetrate even the Matilda's armour. But using them against tanks meant exposing crews to direct fire, something anti-aircraft gunners weren't trained for or equipped to handle. Rommel positioned 88mm guns in a hasty defensive line and waited. When Matildas appeared, advancing through the smoke and confusion, the big guns opened fire. At last, German weapons that could hurt the British tanks. The 88's shells, travelling at over 2,700 feet per second, struck with tremendous kinetic energy. At 1,000 metres, they could penetrate over 100mm of armour. The Matilda's protection, formidable as it was, couldn't stop that. The first Matilda hit by an 88mm round brewed up immediately, the crew killed instantly. The second took multiple hits before grinding to a halt, but killing Matildas required sacrifices. The 88mm guns, large and conspicuous, drew immediate return fire. British tanks and supporting artillery targeted the gun positions. Crews died serving their weapons. Some guns were destroyed before firing a shot. Others got off a few rounds before being silenced. It was brutal, close-range combat where the side that could mass firepower quickest won. Gradually, the German defence stabilised. Not because German tanks suddenly became effective, they remained vulnerable throughout the battle. but because concentrated artillery fire, both 88mm anti-aircraft guns and 105mm field howitzers firing over open sights, created enough firepower to stop the Matildas. Combined with Luftwaffe attacks, this was enough to halt the British advance. By evening, the Arras counterattack had run out of momentum. The British withdrew, having lost about half their tanks, including many Matildas. The Germans held the field. Technically, it was a German victory, but the psychological impact was profound. The Wehrmacht had been stopped cold by a relative handful of tanks, not outmaneuvered, not defeated by superior tactics, simply stopped by armour they couldn't penetrate. German after-action reports from May 21st make fascinating reading. Unit after unit reported the same experience. Standard anti-tank weapons ineffective, losses heavy, enemy tanks nearly invulnerable to all weapons except 88mm and larger artillery. Rommel's report to higher headquarters stated that the 7th Panzer Division had been attacked by hundreds of British tanks. His estimate was 5 times too high, a measure of how devastating the impact had been. The actual number of Matildas engaged was probably fewer than 60. That such a small force could create such chaos and require such drastic measures to stop sent shockwaves through German command. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, the architect of German armoured doctrine, read the reports with concern. The panzer divisions had been designed around speed and manoeuvre, not slugging matches with heavily armoured opponents. If the British could produce tanks that German weapons couldn't defeat, the entire operational concept was at risk. Immediate orders went out to accelerate development of more powerful anti-tank guns and to upgun existing tanks. The Panzer III, backbone of the panzer divisions, would receive a 50mm gun instead of the inadequate 37mm. The Panzer IV would eventually be rearmed with a long-barreled 75mm gun capable of penetrating heavy armour. These changes took time, though. Through the rest of 1940 and well into 1941, German tank crews faced the prospect of encountering Matildas with weapons they knew were insufficient. The fear was real and justified. In North Africa, where Matildas would see extensive service, German and Italian forces discovered the same lesson Rommel had learned at Arras. Standard anti-tank weapons were useless. Only the 88mm gun or larger calibers could reliably penetrate Matilda armour. Italian L3 tankettes and M13 medium tanks were hopelessly outclassed. The Matilda could engage them with impunity, absorbing their fire while destroying them at leisure. German Panzer IIIs in their early versions remained vulnerable. Even when the 50mm gun was introduced, it was the short-barreled version initially, which still struggled against Matilda armour at combat ranges. The Battle of Bir el Gubi in November 1941 demonstrated the Matilda's dominance in the right circumstances. The 4th Armoured Brigade, including a squadron of Matildas, attacked Italian positions defended by M13 tanks and anti-tank guns. The Italian gunners fired desperately as British tanks advanced. Shells bounced off. The Matildas closed to point-blank range and systematically destroyed the Italian armour. One Matilda reportedly took 15 direct hits from Italian 47mm guns and continued fighting without serious damage. The crew didn't even realise how many times they'd been hit until examining their tank afterward. But the Matilda had weaknesses, serious ones that became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. The most obvious was speed. In the mobile warfare of North Africa, 15 miles per hour maximum was crippling. Faster enemy tanks could simply avoid engagement, refusing battle unless conditions favoured them. The Germans learned to bypass Matilda positions, going around rather than through them. The limited range was equally problematic. The twin diesel engines, efficient as they were, couldn't carry enough fuel for sustained operations in the desert. Matildas required constant refuelling, limiting their operational radius. Reliability was another issue. The complex twin-engine transmission system was prone to breakdowns in dusty conditions. Spare parts were chronically short. Maintenance required specialised knowledge and tools. As the campaign dragged on, more Matildas were lost to mechanical failure than enemy action. The 2-pounder gun, adequate in 1940, was becoming obsolete by 1941. It lacked a high explosive shell, only armour-piercing rounds were available, making it ineffective against infantry and soft targets. When German tanks began appearing with thicker armour, the 2-pounder's penetration became marginal. By 1942, facing Tigers and Panthers, it was obsolete. The two-man turret was cramped and inefficient. The commander had to aim and fire the gun while also commanding the tank, handling radio communications and maintaining situational awareness. It was too much for one person. British doctrine had fallen behind German practices, where three-man turrets with separate gunners, loaders, and commanders proved far more effective. Most critically, British industry couldn't produce Matildas in sufficient numbers. The complex casting process for the thick armour, the specialised twin-engine power plant, and the overall manufacturing difficulty meant production rates remained low. Only about 2,900 Matildas were built during the entire war, compared to over 6,000 Panzer IIIs or 8,500 Panzer IVs. By 1942, the Matilda was being phased out of frontline service in North Africa, replaced by American Grants and Lees and British Crusaders and later Shermans and Cromwells. These tanks were faster, more reliable and better armed, even if their armour was inferior. The tactical flexibility they offered outweighed the Matilda's protection. But the Matilda found a second life in the Pacific theatre, where its characteristics were better suited to conditions. In the jungles of New Guinea and the islands of the Southwest Pacific, speed was less important than firepower and protection. Japanese tanks were thinly armoured and lightly armed. The Matilda's 2-pounder could destroy any Japanese armour with ease, while Japanese anti-tank guns, mostly 37mm weapons derived from German designs, were as ineffective against Matilda armour as German guns had been at Arras. Australian forces operating Matildas in the Pacific found them ideal for infantry support in jungle fighting. The thick armour provided protection against Japanese anti-tank rifles, the ubiquitous 47mm guns, and even against close-range suicide attacks. Japanese infantry armed with magnetic mines or satchel charges discovered that the Matilda's armour was thick enough to resist all but the largest explosive charges. The slow speed, a liability in the desert, was less important in jungle terrain where rapid movement was impossible anyway. The Matilda could advance at infantry pace through dense vegetation, providing mobile fire support exactly as originally intended. At the Battle of Boonagona in late 1942 and early 1943, Australian Matildas proved invaluable in reducing Japanese bunkers and pillboxes. The 2-pounder gun, inadequate against heavy armour, was perfectly suitable for blasting apart log and earth fortifications. The thick armour allowed Matildas to approach defensive positions closely, absorbing fire that would have forced lighter tanks to withdraw. In the Borneo campaign of 1945, Matildas supported Australian infantry in some of the last amphibious assaults of the war. Japanese defenders threw everything they had at the advancing tanks: anti-tank guns, artillery, suicide bombers, improvised mines. The Matildas shrugged off most of it and kept advancing. But even in the Pacific, the Matilda was obsolescent by 1944. Australian forces began replacing them with American M3 Grants and later M4 Shermans as soon as supplies became available. The Matilda's last combat action with Australian forces came in July 1945, supporting infantry attacks in Borneo just weeks before Japan's surrender. The Matilda saw service with other nations as well. The Soviet Union received about 1,000 Matildas through Lend-Lease, though Soviet tankers were less than impressed. Accustomed to the fast, mobile T-34, they found the Matilda unbearably slow. Soviet crews nicknamed it the Queen of the Battlefield, ironically, referring to its stately pace. Still, Soviet units used Matildas effectively in defensive battles, where speed was less critical. The thick armour was appreciated, especially early in the war when Soviet tank forces were being rebuilt after catastrophic losses in 1941. Some Matildas served on the Eastern Front through 1943, a testament to their durability. The Germans themselves used captured Matildas when circumstances permitted. Several tanks taken at Arras or in North Africa were pressed into service with Wehrmacht units, usually for training or security duties. German evaluations of captured Matildas praised the armour protection and build quality, but criticised the weak armament, slow speed, and mechanical complexity. One German report noted that the Matilda represented British engineering at its best and worst. Superbly built, well protected, reliable when maintained properly, but fundamentally unsuited to modern mobile warfare. By war's end, the Matilda had been relegated to training duties and infantry support in secondary theatres. The last Matildas in British service were finally retired in 1945, replaced by more capable designs. The tank that had terrorized German forces in 1940 was obsolete by 1945, overtaken by the rapid evolution of armoured warfare. Yet the Matilda's impact on the war was profound and lasting. At Arras in May 1940, those 80mm of armour forced the Wehrmacht to rethink its entire approach to armoured combat. The realisation that German tanks were vulnerable to heavily armoured opponents drove immediate changes in doctrine, tactics, and equipment. The Panzer III received its 50mm gun directly because of encounters with Matildas. The decision to develop the Tiger and Panther tanks was influenced by the need to defeat heavily armoured opponents. The 8mm gun's reputation as a tank killer was born at Arras, improvising against Matildas. German anti-tank doctrine was rewritten to emphasise concentrated firepower and the use of heavy weapons. More broadly, the Matilda demonstrated that armour protection still mattered in an era increasingly focused on speed and manoeuvre. The tank that could survive on the battlefield, absorb punishment and continue fighting had inherent value, even if it couldn't keep pace with more mobile designs. This lesson influenced tank design throughout the war, leading to progressively heavier armour on all sides. Perhaps most importantly, the Matilda shattered German confidence at a critical moment. The Arras counterattack, though ultimately unsuccessful strategically, delayed German operations and contributed to Hitler's controversial halt order that allowed much of the British Expeditionary Force to escape from Dunkirk. Those few hours of chaos caused by invulnerable British tanks made German commanders cautious, uncertain about what other surprises the British might have prepared. That caution saved the BEF. In the years after the war, military historians debated the Matilda's place in the pantheon of great tanks. It lacked the T-34's revolutionary design, the Sherman's versatility, or the Tiger's fearsome reputation. Its production numbers were small, its service life relatively short, its weaknesses significant. But for that brief window from 1940 to 1942, the Matilda II was arguably the most effective tank on any battlefield where it appeared. Its armour was the thickest of any tank in mass production. Its gun, while small, was adequate for the threats it faced. Its reliability, when properly maintained, was excellent. And its psychological impact on German forces who encountered it was profound and lasting. At the Tank Museum in Bovington, England, a restored Matilda Sohm sits in a place of honour among the British armour collection. Visitors can walk around it, appreciating the massive cast turret, the thick armour plates, the compact hull design. Placards describe its specifications and service history, but they can't fully capture what it meant to see one of these tanks advancing through smoke and fire, shells bouncing off its armour, turret traversing slowly to engage targets while machine guns chattered. German veterans interviewed decades after the war still remembered the Matilda with a mixture of respect and frustration. Hauptmann Wilhelm Rothenberg, who survived the war and retired as a colonel, spoke at a military history conference in 1982 about his experiences at Arras. "We thought we understood armoured warfare. We had the tactics, the training, the experience. Then these British tanks appeared and nothing we did made any difference. It was terrifying and humbling. We shot and shot and shot and they kept coming. I lost half my company in 2 hours, not because we did anything wrong, but because our weapons simply didn't work against that armour. We learned that day that having the best tactics means nothing if your guns can't hurt the enemy. The British taught us to respect armour protection, a lesson we remembered when designing the Tiger." Lieutenant Hans Bölter, who bailed out of his burning Panzer 38T at Arras, was captured later in 1940 when Germany invaded Yugoslavia. In British captivity, he was shown a Matilda and asked if he recognised it. His response, recorded by his interrogator, was simple. "I'll never forget that silhouette. That's the tank that should have killed me. I put 7 rounds into it from 500 metres, all hits. It didn't even slow down. When it shot back, my tank exploded. I've never felt so helpless. We were supposed to be the best tank crews in the world. That machine made us look like amateurs." The Matilda's story is ultimately one of specialisation versus versatility, of how a design optimised for one role performed brilliantly in that role, but struggled when asked to do anything else. As an infantry support tank, advancing at walking pace, absorbing defensive fire while suppressing enemy positions, it was unmatched in 1940 and 1941. As a general-purpose fighting vehicle for mobile warfare, it was inadequate. The British learned from this. Later designs, like the Churchill infantry tank, retained thick armour, but addressed the Matilda's weaknesses with better armament, 3-man turrets, and improved mechanical reliability. The Americans, observing British experiences, designed the Sherman as a compromise. Good armour, decent speed, reliable mechanics, and adequate firepower. Not the best at anything, but good enough at everything. The Germans drew different lessons. They pursued heavier armour and bigger guns, leading to the Tiger, Panther, and eventually the monstrous King Tiger. These were formidable machines, but they were also complex, expensive, and difficult to produce in numbers. The Wehrmacht never achieved the mass production that characterized Allied tank programs. The irony is that the Matilda, the tank that started this arms race, was essentially obsolete by the time German heavy tanks appeared. The 80mm of armour that had seemed impenetrable in 1940 was merely adequate by 1943 and insufficient by 1944. The arms race moved so quickly that the Matilda's brief moment of dominance was just that, a moment. But what a moment it was. For those few months when Matildas rolled into battle, German forces faced a weapon they couldn't defeat with standard equipment. They had to improvise, adapt, and ultimately redesign their entire anti-tank arsenal. The 88mm anti-aircraft gun became a tank destroyer. The 50mm anti-tank gun replaced the 37mm. Tanks were upgunned and up-armoured, all because of that squat, slow British tank with armour too thick to penetrate. On May 21, 1940, Hauptmann Wilhelm Rothenburg had been confident, professional, commanding his regiment with the assurance of a man who knew his business. By May 22nd, he was shaken, having watched half his tanks burn while his shells bounced harmlessly off British armour. The experience stayed with him throughout the war. In Russia, commanding a battalion of Panzer IVs in 1942, he encountered Soviet KV-1 heavy tanks and immediately recognised the same problem. Thick armour his guns couldn't penetrate. His after-action report referenced Arras explicitly. We face the same situation we encountered against British Matildas. Standard anti-tank weapons ineffective. We need 88mm guns or larger calibers. The solution at Arras had been to bring up 88mm guns, accept heavy casualties among the gun crews, and batter through the British armour with overwhelming firepower. In Russia, the solution was similar. Concentrate fire, use heavy weapons, and accept losses. But it was never easy, and it was never without cost. Every time German forces encountered armour they couldn't defeat with standard weapons, they paid in blood and burning tanks. The Matilda had taught them that lesson first. By 1945, as British forces pushed into Germany, the Matildas were long gone from frontline service. The tanks that broke through German defences were Shermans, Cromwells and Churchills. Faster, better armed, more versatile. The infantry tank concept itself was dying, replaced by universal tanks designed to handle multiple roles. The specialisation that had created the Matilda was giving way to versatility and mass production. But the legacy remained. Every German anti-tank gun developed after 1940 was designed with the Matilda in mind. Can it penetrate 80mm at combat range? If not, it's inadequate. The Pak-38 50mm gun, the Pak-40 75mm gun, even the massive Pak-40 88mm anti-tank gun, all were built to defeat armour like the Matildas. The Tiger tank's 100mm of frontal armour was specified partly to match and exceed the protection that had made the Matilda so formidable. German tankers wanted what the British had at Arras, the ability to absorb enemy fire and keep fighting. The Panther's sloped armour was designed to maximise effective thickness, achieving Matilda-like protection at reduced weight. In a real sense, every German armoured vehicle developed after Arras carried the Matilda's influence in its specifications. The British didn't realise what they'd created. To them, the Matilda was just another tank, successful in its role but limited in application. They moved on to other designs without fully appreciating the psychological impact their infantry tank had achieved. It was the Germans who remembered, who spoke of Matildas with grudging respect, who redesigned their forces around the lessons learned when their shells bounced off. At military academies around the world today, the Arras counterattack is studied as an example of how small forces can achieve disproportionate effects when properly employed. Fewer than 80 tanks, most of the Matildas, stopped 2 panzer divisions and forced the German army to pause its offensive at a critical moment. The tactical execution was far from perfect. Coordination between the two columns was poor. Air support was inadequate. The infantry couldn't keep up with the tanks. The attack ran out of fuel and ammunition after only a few hours. By any objective measure, it was a failed offensive. Yet it succeeded in its real purpose, buying time and creating doubt. The Germans, so confident in their invincibility, suddenly weren't sure. If the British had tanks that German guns couldn't kill, what else might they have? Were there more Matildas waiting? Were there even better designs? The uncertainty lasted just long enough for the evacuation at Dunkirk to succeed, saving over 300,000 British and French soldiers who would fight again. The Matilda didn't win the war. It didn't even win the Battle of Arras. But it won something perhaps more valuable. It won time. And in May 1940, time was the most precious commodity the Allies possessed. Every hour the German advance was delayed was another hour for defences to be prepared, for troops to be evacuated, for Britain to prepare for the coming storm. The tank crews who fought at Arras didn't know they were buying time for their nation's survival. They knew only that they were advancing through German fire in machines that seemed nearly invulnerable, watching German tanks burn while their own armour deflected enemy shells. It must have been a strange, almost surreal experience for crews who had spent the previous days retreating, watching French and British forces crumble under German assault. Suddenly, they were the ones advancing. They were the ones who were unstoppable. The Germans, always so confident and aggressive, were the ones retreating in panic. Tank Commander Sergeant Harry Watson of the 4th RTR described the experience in a letter written months later after escaping from France. "We rolled through their lines like nothing I'd ever experienced. They shot at us constantly. I could hear shells hitting the hull, loud cracks and bangs. But nothing came through. Our driver kept going. Our gunner kept shooting. We destroyed 4 German tanks that day, watching them brew up while our Matilda took everything they could throw at us. For a few hours, we felt invincible. We felt like we were the better army, the better tanks, the better soldiers. Then we ran out of fuel and ammunition and had to withdraw. But for those few hours, we won. We beat them, and they knew it." That feeling of invincibility, however brief, was important for British morale. After weeks of defeat and retreat, British forces had proven they could hurt the Germans. The Matilda had given them that proof, demonstrating that British engineering and British courage could match the Wehrmacht when conditions were right. The confidence gained at Arras sustained British tank crews through the desperate fighting of 1940 and 1941, when defeats were far more common than victories. The Germans, meanwhile, learned to fear the Matilda. Unit histories from 1940 and 1941 repeatedly mention encounters with British heavy tanks and the difficulties they posed. Intelligence reports warned of Matilda deployments. Tactical briefings emphasized the need for heavy weapons when facing them. Young officers training in Germany were shown photographs of Matildas and taught how to identify them at a distance so proper countermeasures could be deployed immediately. Unteroffizier Franz Kurowski, who served with anti-tank units in France and later North Africa, wrote in his diary about his first encounter with a Matilda near Tobruk in April 1941. "We were told these British tanks were slow and easy targets. What they didn't tell us was that our guns couldn't hurt them. I watched our battery fire 20 rounds at one of these monsters, all hits. The tank didn't even slow down. It drove right up to our position, machine gunning the crews. We abandoned the guns and ran. What else could we do? Stand there and die firing weapons that don't work?" The British tank sat there for 5 minutes, rotating its turret, daring us to come back. Then it drove away. We recovered our guns later, but I never trusted them again. Any time someone reported Matilda tanks, my first thought was, where are the 88s? The psychological dimension of armoured warfare is often underappreciated. Tanks are weapons of shock and firepower, but they're also weapons of fear. A soldier facing an approaching tank experiences primal terror, watching tons of steel and explosives bearing down on a position with nothing to stop it. Anti-tank weapons are meant to provide reassurance, giving infantry the means to fight back. But when those weapons fail, when shells bounce off and the tank keeps coming, terror becomes panic. German infantry at Arras experienced this panic. So did Italian infantry in North Africa. The sight of Matildas advancing through defensive fire, shells ricocheting into the sky, turrets rotating to engage targets, was psychologically devastating. Soldiers who might have held position against lighter tanks broke and ran when Matildas appeared, not because they were cowards, but because they were rational. Standing and fighting when you have no weapon capable of stopping the enemy isn't courage, it's suicide. The Italian army in North Africa was particularly demoralised by Matildas. Italian M1340 medium tanks, the best armour Italy could field, were comprehensively outclassed. Their 47mm guns could penetrate Matilda armour only under ideal conditions at very close range. The Matilda's 2-pounder could penetrate M13 armour from any angle at any combat range. Italian tankers facing Matildas knew they were driving into battle in coffins. Italian anti-tank gunners knew their weapons were inadequate. The result was predictable. Italian units collapsed when Matildas appeared, sometimes without firing a shot. At the Battle of Bardia in January 1941, Australian infantry supported by Matildas from the 7th RTR attacked Italian fortifications. The Italian garrison, over 40,000 strong, was well supplied and dug into prepared positions. They should have been able to hold for weeks. Instead, the fortress fell in 3 days. The after-action reports cited the Matildas as the decisive factor. Italian soldiers interviewed after surrender spoke of invincible British tanks that walked through their defences, destroying bunkers and machine gun nests while absorbing all defensive fire. One Italian machine gunner described watching a Matilda approach his position. "We fired everything we had. The British tank came closer and closer. You could see the bullets striking the armour, see the sparks. It did nothing. The tank stopped perhaps 20 metres from our bunker. The turret turned slowly until the gun pointed directly at us. We could have kept firing. We would have died. Instead, we ran. What else could we do?" This wasn't an isolated incident. Across the Bardia perimeter, Italian positions surrendered or fled when Matildas appeared. The fortress that should have held for weeks fell because its defenders couldn't stop the British armour. The capture of Tobruk later in January 1941 followed the same pattern. Italian defenders, demoralised by previous encounters with Matildas, often surrendered at the first sight of British heavy tanks. Over 25,000 Italian prisoners were taken, along with massive stores of equipment and supplies. The Matildas had done what they were designed to do: support infantry in assaulting fortified positions, using armour protection to close with enemy strongpoints and destroy them with direct fire. But Tobruk also demonstrated the Matildas' limitations. The rapid exploitation after the fortress fell saw British cruiser tanks racing forward while Matildas lumbered behind, unable to keep pace. The pursuit that might have destroyed Italian forces in Libya was limited by lack of fast, mobile armour. Matildas could win the battle but couldn't exploit the victory. This fundamental limitation, inherent in the infantry tank concept, meant Matildas were always dependent on other tank types for complete success. When Rommel arrived in North Africa with the Afrika Korps in February 1941, he brought with him both respect for the Matilda and plans to counter it. His forces included a battalion of 88mm anti-aircraft guns explicitly trained for anti-tank work. Every German anti-tank gun crew was drilled on Matilda recognition and proper engagement procedures, use armour-piercing ammunition, aim for track and suspension to immobilise, concentrate fire to overwhelm. Most importantly, avoid engagement with inadequate weapons. If your gun can't penetrate, retreat and call for heavier support. The German respect for Matildas was evident in their tactical planning. When Rommel attacked British positions at Mersa el Brega in March 1941, his operation orders specifically noted Matilda deployments and assigned 88mm guns to counter them. The attack succeeded partly because Rommel's forces could now deal with the British heavy tanks that had dominated earlier battles. The Germans had adapted, and the advantage the Matilda provided was diminishing. By June 1941, during Operation Battle Axe, the British discovered that German anti-tank defences had evolved to neutralise the Matilda advantage. Attacks across open ground met concentrated 88mm fire that destroyed Matildas at ranges where the British guns couldn't effectively respond. The thick armour that had seemed invulnerable in 1940 was now merely tough, providing protection against small-caliber weapons but vulnerable to dedicated anti-tank guns. The Battle of Halfaya Pass exemplified this shift. British Matildas attacked German positions expecting to overrun them, as they had Italian defenders. Instead, they found 88mm guns positioned in hull-down positions, nearly invisible until they opened fire. The result was catastrophic. 11 Matildas were destroyed in the first hour, more losses than the type had suffered in entire previous battles. The survivors withdrew, mission unaccomplished. German gunners at Halfaya described the engagement with satisfaction. They had finally found the answer to the British heavy tanks. Lieutenant Joachim Schorm, commanding an 88mm battery, wrote in his combat report, "The British tanks advanced in line, very brave but very foolish. We held fire until they reached optimal range, approximately 1-200 meters. Then all 4 guns fired together. The first volley destroyed 3 tanks, the second volley destroyed 2 more. The British formation wavered but continued advancing. We maintained steady fire. By the time they withdrew, 11 burning tanks marked their advance. Our guns suffered no damage. Crew morale is excellent. The men are confident we can defeat any British armour." This confidence was justified. From mid-1941 onward, German anti-tank defences could reliably defeat Matildas if properly deployed. The tactical balance had shifted. British commanders increasingly hesitated to commit Matildas against prepared German positions, knowing the losses would be severe. The tank that had terrified German forces in 1940 was now just another target. The arrival of American Grant and Lee tanks in mid-1942 accelerated the Matilda's obsolescence. These tanks, while still imperfect, offered the 75mm gun that could fire high explosive shells, far more useful against infantry and soft targets than the 2-pounder. They were faster, more reliable, and easier to maintain. British tank units transitioned to American equipment as quickly as supplies allowed, relegating Matildas to secondary roles. By the time of the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942, Matildas were used primarily for mine-clearing operations, advancing slowly through German minefields, while flail tanks and engineers cleared paths for the main assault. It was important work, but no longer the dramatic breakthroughs of 1940 and 1941. The Matilda had become a support vehicle, useful but not decisive. Yet even in this reduced role, the Matilda's armour protection proved valuable. Mine clearing is inherently dangerous work, exposing vehicles to enemy fire while moving at predictable speeds through known danger zones. Lighter tanks suffered heavy casualties performing this mission. Matildas, with their thick armour, could absorb the hits and continue working. Crews performing mine-clearing operations in Matildas had significantly better survival rates than crews in other tank types. The last significant action for Matildas in North Africa came during the pursuit after El Alamein. While faster cruiser tanks and Shermans chased Rommel's retreating forces, Matildas mopped up bypassed positions and supported infantry in reducing strongpoints. It was unglamorous work, but necessary. The thick armour that made Matildas too slow for mobile warfare made them ideal for grinding through stubborn defences. After North Africa, most surviving Matildas were shipped to the Pacific Theatre or to the Soviet Union as Lend-Lease supplies. A few remained in the Middle East for training and garrison duties, but their combat days in the Western Desert were over. The tank that had started the Desert War as an invincible juggernaut ended it as an obsolescent relic, useful but outdated. In the Pacific, the Matilda found conditions more suited to its characteristics. The jungle terrain of New Guinea and the islands prevented high-speed mobile warfare. Battles were fought at walking pace through dense vegetation, across steep terrain, and against fortified positions. The Matilda's slow speed was less of a liability. Its armour protection was more valuable than ever. Australian forces took over most Matilda operations in the Pacific, forming special squadrons equipped with the British tanks. These units developed tactics specifically for jungle fighting, using the Matilda's thick armour to approach Japanese bunkers at close range and destroy them with direct fire. The 2-pounder gun, inadequate against German heavy armour, was perfectly suitable for blasting apart log and earth fortifications. At Buna in late 1942, Australian Matildas supported American infantry in assaults on Japanese defensive positions. The Japanese, accustomed to facing light American Stuart tanks, found their anti-tank weapons useless against Matilda armour. Japanese 37mm guns and 47mm guns, similar to the German weapons that had proven ineffective at Arras, achieved the same results, shells bouncing off British armour while the Matildas methodically destroyed defensive positions. One Japanese survivor, interviewed after the war, described the psychological impact of Matildas. "We called them iron pigs. They moved slowly, making loud engine noises impossible to miss. We fired everything at them. Rifles, machine guns, anti-tank guns, even threw grenades. Nothing stopped them. They came closer and closer, that gun rotating, searching. When they fired, bunkers simply exploded. Men died inside without warning. The psychological effect was terrible. Soldiers who would fight to death against infantry would flee when the iron pigs appeared. The thick armour also provided crucial protection against Japanese close assault tactics. Japanese infantry, trained to attack tanks with magnetic mines, satchel charges and Molotov cocktails, discovered that Matilda armour was thick enough to resist most improvised explosives. Magnetic mines that would cripple lighter tanks left only surface damage on Matildas. Satchel charges had to be very large to penetrate. Even when Japanese infantry succeeded in placing explosives, the Matilda often survived. Sergeant James Murray, commanding a Matilda in the Bougainville campaign, reported an incident where Japanese infantry attacked his tank with multiple explosive charges. They came at us from the jungle, 3 or 4 men carrying what looked like artillery shells strapped together. We couldn't depress the gun far enough to hit them at close range, so we used the machine gun. Got 2 of them, but the others reached the tank and placed their charges against the hull. Huge explosions. The tank rocked. We thought we were finished, but when the smoke cleared, we were still operational. The armour held, some denting on the outside, but nothing penetrated. We backed away and kept fighting. This resilience made Matildas invaluable in the close-quarters jungle fighting where enemy infantry could approach tanks from concealment. Crews felt confident operating near Japanese positions, knowing their armour would protect them from all but the largest charges. This confidence translated into aggressive tactics that lighter tanks couldn't employ. But even in the Pacific, the Matilda's weaknesses remained problematic. Mechanical reliability in tropical conditions was poor. The complex twin-engine system required constant maintenance. Spare parts were chronically short, forcing unit mechanics to cannibalize damaged tanks to keep others running. By 1944, many Australian Matilda squadrons were operating at half strength due to mechanical issues, not combat losses. The limited range was equally troublesome. Island-hopping campaigns required tanks to be transported by landing craft and operate with minimal supply lines. The Matilda's fuel consumption meant constant refuelling, a difficult task when every gallon had to be brought ashore across contested beaches. Commanders had to carefully plan operations around refuelling points, limiting tactical flexibility. As American Sherman tanks became available in larger numbers, Australian forces transitioned away from Matildas. The Sherman offered better mobility, reliability and versatility, while providing adequate armour protection for Pacific conditions. By early 1945, most Australian armoured units had converted to American equipment, with Matildas relegated to training roles or kept as reserves. The last combat use of Matildas came during the Borneo campaign in mid-1945. Australian forces landing on Tarakan Island and later Balikpapan brought Matildas ashore to support infantry attacks on Japanese positions. These final operations demonstrated both the enduring strengths and obsolescence of the design. The tanks performed well in their intended role, supporting infantry and providing direct fire support, but they were clearly outdated compared to more modern designs. On July 1, 1945, during the assault on Balikpapan, Corporal Edward Thompson's Matilda was hit by a Japanese 75mm gun at close range. The shell penetrated the turret side armour, killing the gunner and wounding Thompson. But the tank remained mobile, and Thompson drove it back to friendly lines despite his injuries. Even at the end, the Matilda's robust construction was saving lives, absorbing damage that would have destroyed lesser vehicles. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Australian Matilda squadrons were preparing for the invasion of the Japanese home islands, a campaign that thankfully never occurred. The Matildas were quickly retired after the war, most being scrapped within months. A few were preserved as monuments or sent to museums, but the majority were cut up for scrap metal, their thick armour plates melted down and recycled. The Soviet experience with Matildas was less positive than British or Australian operations. Soviet tankers trained on fast, mobile designs like the T-34 and BT series found the Matilda's slow speed intolerable. Soviet doctrine emphasized breakthrough and exploitation, exactly what the Matilda couldn't do. The thick armour was appreciated, but not enough to compensate for the mobility limitations. Most Soviet Matildas were assigned to independent tank battalions supporting rifle divisions in defensive operations or deliberate assaults. In these roles, they performed adequately. The armour proved valuable on the Eastern Front, where German anti-tank defences were formidable. Soviet crews reported that Matildas could survive hits that would destroy T-34s, though the slow speed made them vulnerable to being outflanked. Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Loza, who commanded a Lend-Lease Sherman battalion but trained on Matildas, wrote in his memoirs about the British tank. "We called it the Queen, but not with affection. It was slow, uncomfortable, mechanically complex, and the two-man turret was absurd. How could the commander fight the tank and command simultaneously? Impossible. But the armour was impressive. I saw Matildas that had taken dozens of hits still fighting. If you needed a tank to hold a position and absorb punishment, the Matilda was excellent. If you needed to advance rapidly or manoeuvre, it was useless." Soviet Matildas saw action in the defence of Moscow in late 1941, during the siege of Leningrad, and in various defensive battles throughout 1942 and 1943. By 1944, as Soviet industry produced enough modern tanks, Matildas were withdrawn from frontline service. Most were used for training or sent to secondary fronts. A few survived the war and were briefly used in the occupation of Manchuria in 1945. German intelligence reports on Lend-Lease Matildas noted their presence, but didn't consider them a significant threat. By 1943, German forces on the Eastern Front faced T-34s, KV-1s, and early Model is tanks. The Matilda, formidable in 1940, was merely adequate by Eastern Front standards. German anti-tank guns that struggled against Soviet heavy armour had no difficulty penetrating Matildas. The complete life cycle of the Matilda, from object of derision to terror weapon to obsolescence, took less than 5 years. This rapid evolution reflected the extraordinary pace of armoured warfare development during World War II. Designs that were cutting-edge in 1940 were outdated by 1942 and obsolete by 1944. The Matilda's thick armour, revolutionary in 1940, was merely standard by 1943, as all major powers fielded heavily armoured designs. Yet for those brief years when the Matilda ruled the battlefield, it fundamentally altered German thinking about armoured warfare. The shock of encountering armour they couldn't penetrate forced tactical, doctrinal and equipment changes throughout the Wehrmacht. The 88mm anti-aircraft gun's evolution into the legendary anti-tank weapon began at Arras. The development of long-barreled high-velocity tank guns was accelerated by Matilda encounters. The emphasis on heavier armour that led to the Tiger and Panther was partly inspired by the protection level the Matilda demonstrated. In a real sense, the Matilda started an armour race that Germany couldn't win. Every increase in German gun performance prompted thicker Allied armour. Every increase in armour thickness required more powerful German guns. The cycle continued throughout the war, with tanks growing progressively heavier, more complex and more expensive. Germany, with limited resources and industrial capacity, couldn't match Allied production. They could build better tanks individually, but not in the numbers needed to win. The Matilda itself didn't survive this arms race, being too specialised and limited for the evolving battlefield. But the lessons it taught, about the value of armour protection, the importance of weapon effectiveness, and the psychological impact of invulnerability, shaped armoured warfare for the rest of the war and beyond. British tank design after the Matilda incorporated its strengths while addressing its weaknesses. The Churchill infantry tank retained thick armour, but added better armament and improved mechanical reliability. The Cromwell cruiser tank emphasised speed, but with better protection than earlier cruiser designs. Post-war British tanks like the Centurion represented the universal tank concept, combining the Matilda's protection with the mobility of cruiser tanks. German veterans, interviewed decades after the war, invariably mentioned the Matilda when discussing memorable combat experiences. Not because it was the best tank they faced. By 1943, Soviet and American designs were more formidable, but because it was the first tank that made them afraid. The first time German tankers realised they could be outmatched. The first time their tactical superiority wasn't enough. Oberst Wilhelm Rothenberg, the officer who commanded at Arras, never forgot May 21, 1940. In his post-war writings about armoured combat, he repeatedly referenced that day as a turning point in his understanding of warfare. "We thought we knew everything. We were the victors of Poland and France. Our tactics were proven, our equipment was superior. Then we met the Matilda. In a few hours, all our certainty evaporated. We discovered that bravery and skill mean nothing when your weapons can't hurt the enemy." That lesson stayed with me throughout the war. Every time we faced a new enemy tank, I remembered Arras and asked, can our guns penetrate it? If the answer was uncertain, I demanded heavy weapons be brought forward first, better to delay the attack than repeat Arras. This caution, born from the Matilda encounter, affected German tactical planning throughout the war. Units that might have attacked immediately instead waited for anti-tank support. Operations that might have succeeded through speed were delayed for proper preparation. The momentum that characterized early Blitzkrieg campaigns was partly lost because German commanders, burned by Matildas, became more cautious about what enemy armour they might encounter. The British didn't fully appreciate this psychological victory. To them, the Matilda was a workmanlike tank that did its job adequately before being replaced by better designs. They focused on its limitations rather than its achievements. Post-war British armour historians often criticised the Matilda for being too slow, too specialised, too limited. They compared it unfavourably to more versatile designs and concluded it was a dead end in tank development. But this assessment misses the point. The Matilda was never meant to be a universal tank. It was designed for a specific role, supporting infantry in assaulting fortified positions. In that role, it was arguably the most successful tank design of the early war period. It dominated every battlefield where it appeared from May 1940 through late 1941. It forced enemy forces to completely redesign their anti-tank defences. It provided a psychological boost to Allied forces during the darkest period of the war. That the Matilda couldn't adapt to changing battlefield conditions doesn't diminish these achievements. Not every design needs to be universal. Sometimes, a highly specialised tool that does one job exceptionally well is more valuable than a versatile tool that does everything adequately. The Matilda was that specialised tool, and for the time it was needed, it performed brilliantly. The final word on the Matilda perhaps belongs to the Germans who faced it. At the 1985 reunion of German and Allied tank veterans, several former Wehrmacht officers were asked to name the enemy tank they most respected. Many named the T-34 for its balance of firepower, armour and mobility. Some named the Sherman for its reliability and numbers. A few named the late-war S-2 or Pershing for their formidable capabilities. But General Major Hans von Luck, who fought on both Eastern and Western fronts, gave a different answer. The most impressive enemy tank? The Matilda. Not because it was the best, technically. The T-34 was better overall, but because of what it represented and when it appeared. In 1940 we thought we were invincible. The Matilda showed us we weren't. It made us afraid. Everything that came after, the Tigers, the Panthers, the 88mm guns, all of it started because we faced a tank we couldn't kill with our standard weapons. The Matilda changed how we thought about armoured warfare. For that reason alone, it deserves to be remembered. The Matilda II infantry tank entered service in 1940 as an embodiment of British infantry support doctrine. It left service in 1945 as an obsolete relic of an outdated concept. But for those 5 years, it taught the Wehrmacht that armour matters, that protection has value, and that mockery turns to respect very quickly when your shells bounce off enemy steel. The Germans laughed when they first saw the slow, ungainly British tank. They stopped laughing at Arras, and they never laughed at a Matilda again.